Now, insofar as the self-certain spirit as a beautiful soul does not possess the power to renounce the knowledge of itself which it keeps to itself, it cannot attain to an identity with the consciousness it has repulsed, nor therefore to a vision of the unity of itself and the other, cannot attain to an objective existence. Consequently, the identity comes about only negatively as a being devoid of spirit. The beautiful soul, lacking in actual existence, entangled in the contradiction between its pure self and the necessity of that self to externalize itself and change itself into an actual existence, and dwelling in the immediacy of this firmly held antithesis, an immediacy which alone is the middle term reconciling the antithesis, which has been intensified to its pure abstraction and is pure being or empty nothingness. This beautiful soul, then, being conscious of this contradiction in its unreconciled immediacy, is disordered to the point of madness, wastes itself in yearning, and pines away in consumption. Thereby, it does in fact surrender the being for self to which it so stubbornly clings. But what it brings forth is only the non-spiritual unity of mere being. Paragraph 668 is entirely focused on this figure, or this gestalt, shape of consciousness of the beautiful soul, and we can see how it's essentially a dead end. And the beautiful soul is a notion that we've already encountered several times in this section, is the consciousness that prides itself on what it thinks itself to be, but doesn't act, doesn't make itself actual, wirklich. It doesn't do what the other, which it calls the evil consciousness, the individual, the acting consciousness, it doesn't do what that consciousness does, and it views itself as being better, as having a certain purity to itself. And now we end up seeing why this really doesn't amount to anything and ultimately leads to what he calls the non-spiritual unity of mere being. So he tells us this self-certain spirit, which is what this entire section has been about, right, as a beautiful soul, does not possess the power to renounce the knowledge of itself which it keeps to itself. Now, what is that knowledge of itself which it keeps to itself? Well, the knowledge of its own condition. Remember that in the passages just prior to this, there was kind of a breakthrough on the side of the other. The evil consciousness confessed its evil, and it was left waiting for the other one, just like somebody holding up a high five, waiting for the other person to clap the hand, and you're like, what's going on here? Instead, the beautiful soul retreated into itself, into its own superiority, and didn't acknowledge its own fault in this. So it says, it cannot attain to an identity with the consciousness it has repulsed, pushed away, rejected, nor to a vision of the unity of itself in the other. And we should, make a few remarks about terms here. So the identity is Gleichheit, and yes, that could be identity. That could also be equivalence. That could also be, in this case, actually, we're going to talk in a few paragraphs about reciprocity. It's not attaining that. The other was ready to give that and say, oh man, I'm a sinner, I screw up, I went off on my own and did what I did. My action isn't completely just, beautiful, noble, whatever. You're like that too, I assume, right? And then the beautiful soul said, no, you're assuming wrong. It's you. That's the problem. So it's not able to attain what here Miller's translating as identity with it. You might say a being able to be in connection with it. And it's not able to have a unity, Einheit, with it either. He's going to use this term identity again, right? Almost immediately after that. It cannot... Identity comes about only negatively as a being devoid of spirit. So this is a very interesting idea. Before that, though, he says it cannot attain to an objective existence. Now, the German text does not actually say objektiv or gegenständlich or anything like that. It just says Dasein. So Miller is kind of reading that in, but that's okay because this is heading in that direction of, this particular sense of objective. And so what do we have over here? We have all of these sort of complexes within the beautiful soul. So he goes on and he says, the identity comes about negatively, the beautiful soul lacking an actual existence. Now, what does it mean to lack an actual existence? Wirklich, right? Out in the world, engaged with things. So the beautiful soul, how does it lack an actual existence? This person does exist. They have a body. They're in the world. They're engaged, in all sorts of things with others. They put on their pants or whatever else they're wearing and go out in town and chit-chat with people. Otherwise, you can't be a beautiful soul, really. You can't just be a beautiful soul entirely locked in your own head. But there is a difference between words and action. There is a difference between thought and action. There is a difference between intentions not carried out, so an ineffective will, and the will that produces action. He goes on and he says, it's entangled in a contradiction. So there's a contradiction, Gegensatz, between its pure self and the necessity of that self, Notwendigkeit, right, to externalize itself, to make itself outer, right, to go out into the world and change itself into an actual existence. And the kind of actual existence that the other has already done. As a matter of fact, you could say, problem with the other is get too much of that actual existence. Wouldn't it be nice if the beautiful soul could do that? So he says, dwelling in the immediacy of this firmly held antithesis. So what do we mean by the immediacy? Unmittelbarkeit can be understood as, it's treating it as a given, right? As something that's just taken for granted and not really questioned. It can also be understood as the lack of mediation. And what was the opportunity for mediation? Talking with the other. It rejected the overtures, the advances, the confession of the other. That could have provided a kind of mediation for itself. Instead, it has this immediacy. And he says this immediacy is the middle term, the means, the connection, reconciling the antithesis, which has been intensified to its pure abstraction and its pure being or empty nothingness. This beautiful soul being conscious of this contradiction, right? So the beautiful soul is really, there's content there, but it really could be any content whatsoever. It's just something where somebody is saying, I'm the good person, I'm the right person, I'm the person who has whatever it is that we're counting as essential, important, and that makes me the kind of person who I am. In some ages it might be being a decadent bohemian. In some ages it might be making a ton of money and being a thought leader or whatever it's going to be, right? Any of those could be the beautiful soul. As a matter of fact, we could come up with example after example after example in our own time of all sorts of modalities of beautiful souls. So is it really reconciled? Hegel says no, because the next thing he says is that it's conscious of this contradiction in its unreconciled immediacy. So it wants things to be, harmonized within itself, but it's not. So he goes on and he says, it's disordered to the point of madness, wastes itself away in yearning, pines away in consumption. Thereby it does in fact surrender the being for self to which it stubbornly clings. What it brings forth is only the non-spiritual unity of mere being. It doesn't really understand itself, and it missed the opportunity to grow in relation to the other and the action of the other by some sort of reciprocal meeting it halfway or counteraction. It missed its opportunity, and now it's kind of shut up in itself and its own discourse about how cool or great or beautiful it is. The true, that is, the self-conscious and existent equalization of the two sides, is necessitated by and already contained in the foregoing. The breaking of the hard heart and the raising of it to universality is the same movement which was expressed in the consciousness that made confession of itself. The wounds of the spirit heal and leave no scars behind. The deed is not imperishable. It is taken back by spirit into itself, and the aspect of individuality present in it, whether as intention or as an existent negativity and limitation, straightway vanishes. The self that carries out the action, the form of its act, is only a moment of the whole, and so likewise is the knowledge that by its judgment determines and establishes the distinction between the individual and universal aspects of the action. The evil consciousness referred to above posits as externalization of itself, or posits itself as a moment, being enticed into openly confessing itself by the vision of itself in the other. But just as the former has to surrender its one-sided, unacknowledged existence of its particular being for self, so too must this other set aside its one-sided, unacknowledged judgment. Just as the former exhibits the power of spirit over its actual existence, so does this other exhibit the power of spirit over the specific notion of itself. In paragraph 669, we now see a shift to focusing on the acting consciousness as opposed to the judging consciousness, the individual versus the universal. But there is a walk-on who doesn't actually push all the other actors off of the stage, but certainly draws the central attention, and that is Geist, or Spirit, who's going to be incredibly important throughout the rest of this section in the few paragraphs that are left. Now, it would be tempting to misread what is going on here as really being about the universal judging consciousness, because there's this reference to the hardened heart, right? And just a few paragraphs earlier, in fact, this is just 2 paragraphs earlier, the last sentence of 667 is, by this hardness of heart, So it's true that there is a hardened heart on the side of the universal consciousness. That's what allowed it to say, screw you, I don't actually want to confess anything on my side after the acting consciousness confessed itself. But what's actually going on here, there was a hardened heart in the past on the side of the acting consciousness when it said, I'm going to act and I'm not going to wait for you to tell me what's what. But eventually it relented. And so its hardened heart has already been broken. And you could say the sign of that, but also the modality of that, took place through this confession that it made to the universal consciousness, also to itself, and now, as we're seeing, to spirit in a broader sense, the community. So he says, the true equalization of the two sides is necessitated by and already contained in the foregoing. So, earlier we saw, just in the last paragraph, there was no Gleichheit, there was no identity. Now we have an Ausgleichung, right? A reckoning, in a way, or a equivalency that's being produced, an equalization. They're being brought into connection with each other. And it's not because of what the universal consciousness was doing, because the universal consciousness is being kind of a jerk throughout this, and it's not just on the side of what the individual consciousness did. There's something bigger going on. So he says, this is a self-conscious and existent equalization. Those are very important. It's self-conscious as it's realized to be the case. It's also of self-consciousnesses which are related to each other. Remember the old lesson from very early on, self-consciousness exists through another self-consciousness, or it has its being, its existence, its actuality, its identity. So he says that the breaking of the hard heart and the raising of it to universality is the same movement which was expressed in the consciousness that made confession of itself. This breaking of the hard heart raised it to universality. It is no longer just an individual. It is an individual who recognizes that as an individual, they're part of something bigger, and that they don't have their meaning just in themselves. They can't just follow their natural or egoistic desires or urges. They need to identify with something more. Now, what that more is going to depend on, the shape of consciousness, the community. We don't have to worry too much about that at this point. So he goes on and he says, the wounds of the spirit heal and leave no scars behind. This is a very famous phrase, and I do want to specify something here. We must always remember that this is a dialectic, which means two things. There is a developmental process that's taking place, which is complex, and in which the two sides, or more than two sides, sometimes can't get away from each other and have to transform. We must also remember that this is not inevitable. Hegel's writing the book as if, this is the natural course that things follow. For every dialectical progression that makes it to this point and then has the wounds of the spirit heal without any scars, there are probably dozens, scores, thousands of similar processes that never make it that far. There are wounds of the spirit that have not yet healed. This is the case of, you might say this is kind of a special case, reconciling all this together. So he says the deed is not imperishable. It's taken back by spirit into itself. And the aspect of individuality present in it, whether as an intention, what the person was aiming at, or as an existent negativity and limitation, straightaway vanishes. Now, what are we talking about there? What would be an existent negativity and limitation? The fact that you attempt something and fail. The fact that you don't have the resources that you need or don't find the gripping point or response. The fact that your plans are well-intended but not particularly well executed. The failings that we call weakness of will or inability to persevere. All of those sorts of things are on the side of the individual, as are their intentions. They're taken up as universal into what we're calling spirit here. You could call this the mind of the community. And this happens all the time. Think about how we teach historical figures and what they were up to. A great example of this would be, Martin Luther King. It was recently Martin Luther King Day, so we had all these people trotting out their little quotes and sound bites and pictures of the guy, saying, we've got to all learn to be, brothers and sisters to each other and get along and get past racism. And that is something that he was all about. But there was so much more to his action, and we overlook the fact that many of the people praising him today would actually have hated him back then and said, they would have been the racists or the white moderates or the people saying, you're too radical or any of those sorts of things. In a way, in a cheapened sense, this illustrates what we're talking about here with how he's been recuperated. And we forget about the fact that, he was, in fact, originally he was not devoted to nonviolence. He was actually, devoted to self-defense and then changed his mind afterwards through thinking, reading, confronting, and he stuck to it, right? Those are the things that we can focus on if we want a better sense of the action. We can think about all sorts of other people as well as prime examples of this. So like he says, the aspect of individuality vanishes. The self that carries out the action, the form of its act is only a moment of the whole. So likewise is the knowledge that by its judgment determines and establishes the distinction between the individual and universal aspects of the action. So the evil consciousness posits this externalization of itself, or posits itself as a moment, being enticed into openly confessing itself by the vision of itself in the other. Who is the other? The universal judging consciousness. This is the dynamic that we saw just a few paragraphs back, right? And he goes on and he says, just as the former, and who's the former? The evil consciousness has to surrender its one-sided, unacknowledged existence of its particular being for self, so too must this other, the beautiful soul, set aside its one-sided, unacknowledged judgment. And so what is spirit doing? It's taking the individual action, the deed, the tat, right? Also the action in the sense of comportment, Handlung. There's an externalization that has to take place here. That externalization produces a wound. Every externalization produces a wound within the spirit from this Hegelian perspective, but it's a wound that can heal without any scar, without, what does it mean to have a scar? Some people like scars because they're like an emblem of something. Oh, man, look at what I went through. Like I think about my scars. I've got a scar here from when I was young and stupid and was breaking boxes with my bare hands and there was a steel bar in there and I got cut on it and taken to the hospital and they stitched it up and you can still see it there, right? And I could say, oh, my battle wound, I'm a tough guy, right? Or I could talk about the brand that I have on my hand of a cross that we burned into our hands when I was young and stupid as a blood brother thing. That's still there. Very, very hard to see. So scars can be markings, but scars also inhibit. They reduce mobility. They give you problems later on, like this one, things never completely healed up right, and I still get pains in here from time to time, and the skin doesn't stretch as well. So healing with no scar means a sort of fluidity and adaptability that's quite important. To bring this to a close, look at the last thing that he says. Just as the former exhibits the power of spirit over its actual existence, right? Spirit is mastering what the evil individual consciousness is doing, the person who actually exists. It's also exhibiting the power of spirit over the specific notion of itself in the beautiful soul. So this term notion is going to be quite important, the Begriff, the concept. This has a self-concept because it doesn't actually have any action. And now we have to see where we go after this. The latter, however, renounces the divisive thought and the hard-heartedness of the being for self which clings to it because it has, in fact, seen itself in the first. This first consciousness, which turns its back on its actual existence and makes itself into a superseded particular consciousness, thereby displays itself as, in fact, a universal. It returns from its external actual existence back into itself as essential being, and therein the universal consciousness thus recognizes itself. The forgiveness, which it extends to the other, is the renunciation of itself, of its unreal essential being, which it put on a level with that other, which was a real action, and acknowledges that what thought characterized as bad, that is, action is good, or rather it abandons this distinction of the specific thought in its subjectively determined judgment, just as the other abandons its subjective characterization of action. The word of reconciliation is the objectively existent spirit which beholds the pure knowledge of itself qua universal existence in its opposite, in the pure knowledge of itself qua absolutely self-contained and exclusive individuality, a reciprocal recognition which is absolute spirit. In paragraph 670, we finally see a decent response on the part of the universal judging consciousness, which allows Hegel to talk in the end of a reciprocal recognition, gegenseitiges Anerkennen, that is absolute spirit. And, you could say this is really happening late in the game. There's actually not that much development going on here, and at the risk of saying that the spirit section could have been prolonged, you almost wish that he'd said a bit more about just what's happening on the side of the universal judging consciousness, because the reconciliation happens so quickly after so much work on the side of the individual acting consciousness. So he says, the latter, which is the universal judging consciousness, renounces this divisive thought and the hard-heartedness of the being for self which clings to it, because it has, in fact, seen itself in the first, in the other consciousness. And this is an advance. It realizes something. And remember that the way in which the individual acting consciousness was able to overcome its own heartedness and to confess itself, make the overture to the universal judging consciousness, which then was repulsed by it, was by seeing its own self in the other. And there's something really central and important here. So he says that this first consciousness, which turns back on its actual existence and makes itself into a superseded, that is aufgehobene, right? Particular consciousness, a diesen, a this, right? Thereby displays itself as in fact a universal. So it displays Darstellung, right? It sets itself out there. It puts itself out there, literally, for the other and for itself, for the world, as a universal. And this goes back to the previous paragraph where we saw that the individuality of the action is in some respects superseded. You know, the wounds of the spirit created by action heal without scars. But something else is happening here. He says it returns from its external, actual existence, its wirklich Dasein, right? Back into itself as an essential being, as a Wesen, as something that is important, that holds our attention. Now, here's where the other consciousness now does something. He says, therein the universal consciousness thus recognizes itself. Well, this recognition, anerkennen, it is recognizing itself. It's recognizing by looking at the other and what the other is doing that I am also a being like that. But I think you can also read here, I think you can read recognizes in a double way. It recognizes the other for the first time in a way that has been lacking. It's been misrecognizing the other, labeling the other as evil, a label that the other was willing to take on insofar as there was some truth to it, but it's been holding itself to be the beautiful soul, and now it's saying, actually, I'm not. I'm like the rest of you. So he says the forgiveness which it extends to the other is the renunciation of self, of its unreal, essential being, which it put on a level with that other, which was a real action, and acknowledges that what thought characterizes bad, that is action is good, or rather it abandons this distinction of the specific thought in its subjectively determined judgment. So there's a lot going on there. Let's unpack that. What is the universal consciousness doing? So he says that it's extending forgiveness to the other. And I think we really need to read the forgiveness here as happening on both sides, but in different ways. I think there's also a forgiveness occurring on the side of the individual consciousness who's like, yeah, you prick, you finally get it, don't you? Okay, let's reconcile. Let's acknowledge each other. But this forgiveness on the side of the universal consciousness, which it should have given when the acting consciousness first confessed, and it didn't give, is now being given. And this is taking place through confession happening, through admission is another way we could say it. Admission and acknowledgement, recognition of self and of other takes place through these modes of confession and forgiveness at this point in the phenomenology, really late in the spirit section. So he goes on and he says that this is a renunciation of its unreal essential being, which, and we could insert here, it wrongly put on a level with that other which was a real action, right? It was wrongly thinking that it was better than the acting consciousness. It was wrongly identifying itself as a beautiful soul. And now it's putting that aside. And also acknowledging, hey, I was a jerk by pretending to be better than everybody else. So it abandons this distinction of the specific thought and its subjectively determined judgment, just as the other, who's the other? The acting consciousness, abandons its subjective characterization of action. And then here we have a really interesting conclusion. The word of reconciliation is the Now, again, Miller is adding objectively. We don't need objectively in there. The existent, Dasein is spirit, which beholds the pure knowledge of itself as universal essence in its opposite. What would be the opposite of itself as universal essence? In the pure knowledge of itself as absolutely self-contained and exclusive individuality. So now both sides are grasping themselves as both universal and as individual, and they're grasping themselves as the universal through individuality, and they're also reciprocally acknowledging or recognizing each other as individuals within this universal essentiality.